and national and international events. So it's a real educational resource. So I hope you'll find a chance to look at those. I want to get right into the questions and get talking here. A little bit of context: the past decade was the hottest on record by far, and the oceans are at the warmest temperatures they've been at, since we've been keeping track of this stuff in the 1800s. So I want to give that as a little bit of background. And Katie, I thought we might start with you. And do you want to talk about your project that you worked on, that project in Alaska? The correct pronunciation is Inupiat, is that correct?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how that project came together and what it is that you saw working with that indigenous population?
Sure. The project started sort of by chance. I got this assignment to photograph a dog sled race in the Yukon. And I'd been mostly working in Latin America and the Middle East up until then. And it was a 1,000-mile dog sled race. And at every checkpoint, you would get to a new village. A lot of them were indigenous communities, some weren't, but they all had kind of these similar stories about how everything was changing. The weather was getting warmer, the rivers were thawing, and it was transforming the race. But also, I was just sort of seeing firsthand how people's daily lives were changed. Kind of just inspired me to kind of switch gears and start focusing on climate change and the environment. Up until then, I'm from New York City. I wasn't really a nature person, had never been to Alaska, anywhere like that. I kind of cared about the environment because that's my politics, but I didn't really understand, I hadn't really seen it firsthand. So I felt like it's very important to share these stories about people firsthand, because climate change is a really tricky thing to document and to tell news about and to get people to care about. So then I focused on Alaska, which is possibly the Arctic is the fastest warming place in the world, and Alaska's warming incredibly fast. It might be the fastest warming place in the Arctic. I'm not sure. I don't know if you know Kadir, there or Svalbard, they were saying, as far as the temperature changes. But and initially I was focusing mostly on communities that depend on subsistence hunting. So Inupiat communities in the far north. There's different indigenous groups in Alaska, but the Inupiat hunt whales and other marine mammals and depend on that. And with the sea ice changing, their hunting practices were being really affected. So that was a main focus of the project. But then over time, I started looking at permafrost. I started looking at communities that were forced to relocate. And I'm still working on it. I was actually supposed to be in Newtok again, which is a community, one of the first communities that is relocated explicitly because of climate change in Alaska. I was supposed to be there right now, so that won't happen.
Right. And is it simply a question of them moving inland and continuing with what they've always done, or are there real repercussions that are destroying their ways of life?
What's really interesting in this case is, destroying the way of life would be if you force people to move to the city. And in this case, they're moving to another community, which is on rocky land. So because this town is now sinking because of thawing permafrost, and it's their land and it's what they're used to, and they have such a close relationship to it. So it is pretty traumatic to have to move. But in this instance, they want to move. The conditions that they're living in, they have no running water. They use honey buckets as toilets. That's which is what it sounds like. Dealing with floods constantly. So, and they didn't choose that place. Before the 1950s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in the 1950s, relocated them there. They chose that location. It's not a good location, but a barge can arrive. So, they kind of were forced to live there. And then once again, now we're kind of forcing them to move. So that's traumatic, but things will be better for them in this new community. The kids are excited because they're going to get a playground. There's, so it's complicated, and it's not all sort of this sad story.
Right. Great. It's good that there's some duality to it. And you've gotten a lot of support on this. You did the project for National Geographic.
Yeah, and so I started this project as independently, just kind of getting grants and trying to pick up assignments while I was up there. because it's pretty expensive to get to the Arctic. So once you're there, you kind of you want to take as much advantage of it as possible. And then about 2 years ago, I got an assignment from National Geographic to document permafrost in both Alaska and Siberia. So then I worked on that simultaneously for the last 2 years.
Gotcha. Great. We can segue, Kadir, actually, too. This is a great opportunity because you've been working up near the Arctic Circle for quite some time, along with Yuri Kozyrev. And can you talk about the changes that you've seen up there, the environmental changes that are happening? I'm told that it's warming, the Arctic is warming 2.5 times faster than the rest of the Earth, which is already warming quickly. Can you discuss what you've seen?
Yeah, probably at least. Well, the Yuri and I is a interesting history. Yuri is Russian. I'm Dutch. So Yuri and I know each other for a long time. We are both co-founders of NOR, our agency. And Yuri worked in the Arctic a long time ago. Actually, his father was a pilot, a helicopter pilot in the Soviet Union, who used to fly the routes to the Arctic. Actually, in the end, his helicopter crashed, so he lost his father actually in the Arctic. So Yuri has a very strong connection to the Arctic. And I've been coming first time to the Arctic which was in Russia as well, actually in early 2000s. So Yuri and I, we were both speaking for quite a long time to collaborate and work together in the Arctic. And Yuri, being Russian, working in the Russian Arctic, assuming that he would have better access than I would have, and I would work in the Western Arctic, assuming that I would have better access there. As Katie mentioned already, it's incredibly expensive to work there. So that was the biggest obstacle, especially to approach it from a more global level. So it was actually the Carmagnac, which is an important photojournalism grant. Every year it's awarded to a photographer, and every year there's a theme connected to it. So 1 year, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, it was the Arctic, and we knew we had to apply. And it was the first time it was awarded to two photographers, and we got the grant, and we worked there for, well, quite quick actually, because there was a deadline to it as well. But it's been pretty amazing, and what you're seeing now is the Washington Post who published it, and which was an amazing collaboration. Nick is on this Zoom as well, so we could talk about it. It was a supplement, which was, I think, maybe the first time or one of the first times that the supplement was done. Yeah.
I feel like the way that it was published, I don't want to take anything away from Nick, but the way that a lot of your stuff has been published is quite revolutionary. And I feel like with Nick on this, you also are really pushing the boundaries in visual language and displays and getting the work out. Nick, can you talk for a minute about how this came about and how you designed this and put this together? There's a fair amount of drone
Absolutely,
footage.
yeah. So you know, as this was a. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I said there was a fair amount of drone footage in this, a lot of writing. It wasn't just a photo project, obviously.
Absolutely, and you know, as Kadir said, this at least the Arctic piece was funded by the Carmagnac Photojournalism Foundation. So this was a project that the two of them already had pretty well planned, and so we came along sort of midway through, and it was a little difficult for us to you know, we couldn't take the project just as a whole as visuals. We didn't feel like we get the same sort of newsroom support. So we decided that we needed to work with a reporter and sort of bring a sort of fresh angle to the Arctic, not just, you know, the project that they started was very broad and covered so many different aspects of it. It was sort of hard to do that. So we sort of focused on the sort of national security angle. And so as you can see, the text throughout the piece sort of focuses on that, while
Right.
we jumped out into other sections that are all these other aspects that are part of it, such as industry and how that's changing, and the sort of melting landscape. So, working with our amazing design department, we sort of tried to figure out a way to bring viewers out of the experience of this sort of traditionally written story and then into these sort of really rich visual sections from Kadir and Yuri. And I think it does it pretty well. So we're very happy with the way that came about. But in talking with Kadir and Yuri, having all of these different media, drone footage, really helped bring this to really engaging presentation.
Right. And Kadir, you've, for a long time, I mean, I've known you for many years, you've been kind of pushing the envelope in terms of technology, in terms of new ways of storytelling. I mean, this is not, this is not like your Diamond project where you're shooting, black and white and that's pretty much it. I mean, this is, you've really been pushing the envelope with this. Can you talk about that? And do you have any new techniques or new technology that you're using? Or do you want to keep that a secret?
No, I'm happy to speak about. I mean, let's be clear on this. This was more using these different technologies or platforms was more born out of a necessity than out of a desire.
Okay.
I mean, I think photojournalism is in a very difficult, or journalism as a whole is in a difficult position. There's less budgets. There's it's really a challenge to. Doesn't matter how long your career is to make it work and to make enough money out of it and to do something which really makes sense and is important enough. So to use, I had to train myself to be able to write a bit as well. I started before the drone, I was using a kite. So I had a kite and somebody helped me to build a rig, and I had a small camera in the rig, no live view. So I just had to gamble what the image would be. But, started to work on an app and the iPad. And, I think, that video became very important. So both Yuri and I shot a lot of video footage in the Arctic, which actually played out quite well because it became a documentary as well for Dutch public television. So, I think it's a tricky balance, right? Because as a photographer, to shoot video is a very different medium and a very different concentration, and you use very different senses than if you're photographing. So it really requires that you understand what you can do and what you cannot do, and where you're. So I'm a photographer. So is Yuri, right? So that's our primary goal. What we do next to it is complementary and can bring more to the table and can make the project richer. And the Washington Post, as I said, they did an incredible supplement, which we were really proud of. But their online, as you can see, was just as important, or even much more important, because it's seen by many more people.
But your drone piece, using a drone here, you wouldn't have been able to sort of get at the same sort of scale and the vastness that the Arctic is without it.
Yeah, and I'm over the years I've been working more and more on climate stories, and sometimes really aerials are crucial to whether you speak about an environmental story like on how we manage waste in the world, or you talk about how the sea levels are rising in the world, or the Arctic. It's
Exactly. I mean, I know you used a lot of these techniques on your waste project, which was extraordinary. That also ran in the Washington Post, I believe. And if anybody hasn't seen that project, it's pretty incredible. I'm wondering, I know you covered Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans with Stanley Green back in the day. Did that spark your interest in moving into environmental work?
It did actually, you know, I mean, it was very funny because Katrina happened in August 2005, as most of us will remember.
Right.
And I remember that all these photographers were at this festival in Perpignan called Visa pour l'Image, right? Which is the biggest photojournalism festival in the world. And all, you know, when an event like that happens, all these photographers, they get very nervous, and we should go, and you know, they make each other very nervous. And I was like, I'm not going because I'm not covering natural disasters. And I remember the front page the day after Katrina. I remember the front page of the New York Times, which said New Orleans escaped a major disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And then a few hours later, the city was flooded.
Right.
So I'm from the Netherlands, which means the lowlands. So I live below, I'm sitting below the sea level. I live below the sea level.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of grew up with the sea and the dangers of the sea. And we had some of the major floods in the Netherlands. So I started to understand that this was basically a man-made disaster. Mm-hmm. So I went there because and that's where I started to understand that this was not only a man-made disaster, but that these hurricanes, their increasing frequency and their
right.
force, which was increasing, had
right.
to do a lot with the climate crisis. So
Mm-hmm.
True, that's probably the first time I did a story which was actually related to the climate.
Right, right. And then you and Stanley did an exhibition, and you put it in the back of a truck, and you drove it across America.
Yeah, well,
That's
not
one
a
way to
whole
get the work out.
Well, the problem was that Stanley and I, you know, we were there. We spent there 3 weeks, both of us. And then we went back 6 months later. We went back a year later, and we actually followed the whole Katrina aftermath for 5 years, 4 years. Mm-hmm. And we thought that, and basically my focus was on all the families which were not able to return. Right. To New Orleans, which were like incredible. I mean, I think it was the biggest displacement in the U.S. For many decades. So there were like these million people from New Orleans or from Louisiana who were stuck in Houston and in other cities. Yeah. So I focused on these families and their attempts to go back, and we tried to sell this story after 4 or 5 years because we thought it was good to pay attention to this and to show that this story was still relevant 5 years after Katrina happened, and it was impossible sale because no one was interested in Katrina anymore. And then somebody said, okay, you know what you should do? You should rent a truck, put the images in the truck, and just drive around with like a roadshow, an exhibition. And I brought 2 of my families, and they were the guides of the exhibition, and we did a road tour through Texas and Louisiana, and we ended on the anniversary in New Orleans. Right. And we got the attention because we were guests in many breakfast shows, right. And a lot of television stations. So it didn't really bring us the money, but it definitely brought us more attention than we would have ever dreamt of.
Right. Katie,
so
you've also...
again, you know, I mean, you have to be kind of a little bit creative in to find your outlets and to reach your audience.
I would just say, if there's any young photographers working out there, Kadir is kind of a genius at doing a project and selling it 4 different ways, and doing an article and doing a photo essay and doing a movie. And you know, he gets the maximum doing a book out of it. You know, I've never seen a photographer get kind of a more developed I guess strategic plan in getting the story out than Kadir. So if you're starting out in photography, please check out his work and look at the different ways that he maximizes his projects.
I'm stranded now, though.
How so? You're on a boat in Amsterdam?
Yeah, but you know, I mean, like Katie says, you know, I mean, we are working on a follow-up in the Arctic, Yuri and I, but we cannot travel. So it's yeah. Well, we all in the same boat, so to speak.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating. Yeah. Katie, I know you've also, I mean, you have a real long-term commitment to projects. Are you going to continue to work long-term with the Inupiat, or are you going to work on things in mainland US?
Yeah, I think I was a visiting professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in 2018, and I feel like I got a lot of work done. I don't think this project is over by any means, and I think this is a photo from Geographic, which used to be called Barrow, and they sort of have the most famous spring whaling that happens, and I don't think I'll stop going ever, really. You know, I've made friends there, and it's a meaningful time. You know, it might not be every year like I was doing when I was sort of in the throes of this project, but
Right.
I don't think you kind of get it like hooked on Alaska and the Arctic, and it's just the most beautiful place. There's nothing like it, so I can't quite imagine not working there. But I do want to focus on some more stories in the lower 48 and in the United States. And so I'm kind of, there's some other projects that I'm working on, and even working back in Latin America a little bit, giving myself sort of like some warm weather break from 5 years of working in the Arctic.
Yeah, right. And you'd worked in you'd worked in Latin America and Mexico, I think in particular, for quite some time. Are there also climate related dynamics that are related to the stories you've done down there? Anything you'd want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's definitely, we're going to start seeing a lot of, I mean, we already are lots of immigration and climate change related stories, you know, as to what's making people move. I just recently did a story, and then the sort of combination with conservation. I just did a story about this, the Monarch butterfly Biosphere reserve there, which is in Michoacan, which is a pretty dangerous state. It's got a lot of kind of drug war violence and mafia controlled businesses. And then you've got this huge area of protected land and all of these trees and sort of farmland that it could be there instead of these protected trees. So there's a kind of conflict going on. And so it's, and just as in the environment becomes more and more precious to conserve, you're seeing a lot of violence happening against environmental activists all over Latin America, all over the world, but a lot in Latin America. That's an issue that I want to look into.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And is it that they're preserving land that drug traffickers want to cultivate, or drug routes, or? Yeah,
yes and no, exactly. So it's just sort of the place is controlled. You know, everybody's got to pay in. If any money is getting made, it's got to go, you know, to sort of whoever's in charge as far as you know, what cartel is there. And so in this area, and for a long time, this area has sort of been apart from that, and it hasn't been touched by it. But for whatever reason that I don't quite know, whatever's going on within that, like within their drug wars, is causing them to sort of now be encroaching on this butterfly reserve. Yeah. So, but and then there was a murder of and this was sort of why this became a news story. A really well-known manager at the Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, who's always on the internet making videos trying to protect the monarch butterfly, was murdered. And so that's sort of how, you know, people are coming to start to pay attention to the issue that it's getting more and more dangerous.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And these are monarch butterflies that are migrating thousands of miles from North America, correct?
Yes, and so this is the eastern monarch butterfly population, which is doing a little bit better than the western one. Or if I don't know if I'm confusing, one of them is endangered. This population is not yet endangered, but it's at risk coming. And it is, they come from as far away as Canada, California, thousands of miles. It's incredible. I mean, just like being there, I recommend everybody go when we can travel again. It's an incredible experience. And it's just so beautiful, and it's such a natural phenomenon, and, you know, feels so precious. But the complicated thing is, not everybody's making, you know, and the folks that live around there work at the reserve as guides. And this is a place where, even where you've got something as attractive as far as an ecotourism solution, as opposed to an extractive industry like logging, you've got a great ecotourism opportunity. It's still not getting to everybody, and there's still issues. So we're trying to figure out, you know, what to do, as if ecotourism can be this environmental solution in places like Brazil, in all of these areas, as an option against industrial agriculture. But it's not. it's not yet, you know, quite frankly. So we still need to figure out how to protect the environment and and how to have people still make a living. And this is like, you know, we're seeing this everywhere in the world.
Right, right. And partly that may not be a great solution because it's going to involve thousands or tens of thousands of people getting on airplanes and flying down there, which is a major cost for climate damage. Yeah. It reminds me, Kadir, you were here a couple of years ago when you were working on your project around the U.S. on climate change, and you said you came back from Florida and just shook your head and said, "Man, Miami is fucked, and it's just a question of time." Are there places in the U.S. where you see people as really living on the brink and in real danger of losing, you know, large communities or even cities?
Yeah, I think so. Not only in the US, obviously. I mean, maybe the Netherlands as well. You know, well, this project was really addressing the urgency of what's happening with the rising sea level. And over the years, I've been really looking at regions where there is a serious where it's actually happening. You know, that was my whole attempt, which was a real challenge as a photographer. So how do you visualize something that might not be visual yet, but is at the same time kind of happening? You know, because if you talk to people about the rising sea level, people are like still like, I don't really see it, it's not happening. Is it really true? So what I really try to do is to show that the problem is much earlier, because land gets inundated, the people lose their agricultural land because it gets saline, there's no drinking water. And Miami was really, you know, I mean, Miami is there's nothing like Miami in the world, because Miami has this very particular problem, which is that it's built on limestone.
Right.
So a lot of engineers, especially the Dutch, who are supposed to be the experts in terms of coastal protection and management, have come to Miami to think of a plan to protect the city, and everybody concluded that it cannot be protected because you can build a dike on it, but the water will just go under it.
Good land. Yeah.
So you know, that was like a real, for me also, like you know, I realized that this is not something for the next generation or two. This is something which is happening today. And Miami Beach needs to be evacuated probably by 2050. That's the estimate now. And
we're not talking about the beach. We're talking about the whole community. We're talking about the city.
It starts with the Miami Beach, and then it's the whole of Miami. So you know, and in the end, the whole of Florida. But you know, I mean, I think we got used really to that we can kind of, we believe that we can manage the climate, although we have fucked it up, and that we still think that we can stay where we are, and that's including where I am right now, which is Amsterdam. I'm speaking from Amsterdam.
But you don't think it's partly the fault of the Dutch, who've been able to manage the sea level for hundreds of years? I'm not trying to I'm not trying to make it your fault rather than President Trump's, but.
No, I mean, but obviously, you know, I mean, you know, the sea level, through history, the sea level has risen before, and it has been much lower than before. But the difference is obviously what we have done to the climate in the last century has speeded up this whole process. So what happened before maybe and took 1,000 years or many generations where people were able to adapt is now happening in 1 or 2 generations.
Sure.
So, you know, the predictions even for Amsterdam is like, if we continue the way we continue, Amsterdam will need to relocate by the end of the century, which is in 80 years. Right. Which is strange to realize.
Yeah, amazing. You know, we talked a little bit earlier about regulations and laws and such. I want to get to that in a second, but Nick, I had a question for you. I hope this isn't too controversial for you to attack, but as newspapers are, you know, closing down all over the country, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of newspapers have closed down. There are major cities that no longer have a daily newspaper. Jeff Bezos purchased the Washington Post, has been pouring money into it. and supporting the types of long-term projects that you're working on. And it's fascinating that President Trump has been openly attacking the Washington Post, enemies of the people, and this type of stuff. Does it alter the way? Is this in the back of your mind as you're doing these projects? Are you censoring yourself in any way, or are you aware of this conversation that's going on, or are you just charging ahead with your work?
Well, I mean, you're exactly right. We're in a very privileged position, and my heart goes out to all of those journalists recently at other news organizations and freelancers that have really been struggling because of the pandemic. So a really tough time to be a journalist, and very privileged to have the job I do. But it's a little scary and alarming that the amount of distrust towards journalists. You look at what happened last week in Long Island with the video journalist who was covering a demonstration. It's very alarming, and I can't necessarily speak for my colleagues who cover the White House every day and who are out there in the field, because I'm in the office. But one thing that we are doing is we're trying to be very transparent about the way we do our jobs and the way we publish articles. And for one example, I worked on a recent project called the Afghanistan Papers, and a lot of all of this reporting came from documents. And so within the presentation of how we wrote the story and presented the 6 sort of pieces, we made sure that we had a database of documents that linked directly to quotes that we used. And so I think there's something to be said about being even more transparent in this time with the way that we do our jobs. But we'll continue to do what we always have done, which is to tell well-reported and fair stories.
Why do you think, Nick, that that the right in America and Republicans in general are not signing on to the climate change, sort of the belief in climate change? There's very much like a political divide as to whether or not you believe that the earth is warming and that the warming is caused by man. And it fascinates me to no end that your political beliefs about religion, abortion, and any number of other things sort of correlate to whether or not you believe in climate change. Do you see that in your work, or?
I'm not going to touch that one.
Okay, sorry.
No. I mean, like, I'm not a. I don't.
You're not coming from a political point of view.
Coming from a political point of view with this, yeah.
Right. And so you feel like the Washington Post coverage has basically been go out and report what they see and back it up with science and facts, and that's where you're at.
Yeah, and I see how. I work with our investigative team, and I every day see how thorough and careful they are in all of their reporting to get it right. Right,
and it's not opinion pieces. It's science based.
Yeah, so I work in the newsroom,
right,
and not the editorial side of things.
Yeah, and increasing, unfortunately, a large number of people don't understand the difference between the editorial side and the op-ed side. So. That's a topic for another discussion. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
Yeah. Katie, I want to talk a little bit about deregulation. Almost from the day that he took office, Trump has been involved in massive deregulation of anything having to do with the environment. We've got a timeline on our exhibition that Cynthia Rivera has put together, and it's sometimes almost every day they're rolling back regulations, everything from the Paris Accords to local things, protecting animals, etc. And the head of the EPA that Trump had appointed was Scott Pruitt, who's actually an energy lobbyist for oil and gas. David Bernhardt, who's the current Secretary of the Interior, I believe, is a fossil fuel industry lobbyist. I mean, he's actually worked for oil and gas industries as a lobbyist. So, I mean, I think by any standard, and again, I'm not a rabid left-wing Democrat, but I think by any standard, we've got, the foxes are guarding the hen house at this point. Can you talk about any of the rollbacks that you've seen on regulations and
it's almost absurdist, the level where it's like, pretty much everything that was sort of the pride of the Obama administration as far as what they wanted to do for the environment is getting chopped away at. And even and looking at Alaska is a great example. There's plans to build this road to this mine that cuts right through the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, and it's been defeated, tons and tons of times over, and now it's back on the table, and kind of sneaking it through. So not only have you been kind of chipping away at all of these environmental regulations, and then the EPA is essentially lobbying front for the oil industry, but since the coronavirus, that's what's really disconcerting, because with it's a huge, massive distraction for them to just make all of these changes. So I think the biggest one they can't penalize any companies for pollution the way that they used to. So companies just are allowed to go way over that the quotas that they used to have. But then also for fuel, there's no cap there anymore, and that made a really big difference. So that's going to make a huge difference in the amount of fossil fuels and carbon and methane that gets into the atmosphere, which is really terrifying, because we're also looking at the issue of permafrost thawing, and when that begins, it'll begin this sort of feedback loop where it'll make the Earth decidedly warmer, to a point that might not even make fossil fuels important anymore. It'll do it so fast if that happens. So it's just it's kind of it's terrifying. It's terrifying that just sort of somebody can do that much damage in 4 years.
Right. One of the things that struck me was they were just handing out leases, drilling leases, mining leases on public lands all across America. Just to almost every national park in America, they were opening up to various types of energy exploration. At the same time that they were ignoring or negating solar and wind power, which is kind of mind-boggling. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see. I feel like in the United States, one of the only ways, apart from just electing the right people, it would be nice if there was a way that religion and religious groups also became environmental activists. And that's kind of a movement that I could see making a really big difference in the US, because right now it's just like there's two sides and nobody's convincing each other otherwise. There kind of needs to be some other front that comes in and it can influence people.
Yeah, it'd be nice if it was depoliticized, if it didn't correlate to a political party, and we just saw it as an issue where we've got to save the Earth and use the resources that we have. Yeah. I'm wondering if any of you are seeing other work out there that you really care about by other photographers or multimedia people, specifically on the climate long-term projects. Has anybody seen anything that they cared about or that influenced them?
I love so one thing I love seeing work from people that are kind of from places. So I'm loving the work. I'm gonna butcher her name. A woman who shoots for Nat Geo. Her name's Eugenia Arbogenia. Her work is just so beautiful. So I'm just like, and sometimes it's a little bit heavy documenting everything that I do in the Arctic is about the climate crisis, and sometimes it's just nice to remember how how magical and beautiful it is, and look at images that are just beautiful photography of this incredible place that we want to save, and that aren't depressing.
Are those the pictures of, I think, Siberia? Is it Evgenia?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Amazing. I've always loved that work. Yeah. She came in
there's
here.
a number of great stories, right, in the Amazon, the recent the fires in the Amazon. I mean, I think there's incredible work out there, and which people have to see, and people will see it. Still, I feel a little bit like what was said before is like, how many visual proof do we need to convince people that that we are really in trouble? And it puzzles me, and I think maybe in Europe we are still in a little bit better position than you are in the US currently, And the US will pay a very high price for what this administration is doing in just a very few years. But even in Europe, you know, I mean, I've said that before, you know, I think that sometimes it's also our political systems which are failing us, because like in the US, it's the same in Europe, you know, political parties or presidents, they run for the next election.
Right.
And, you know, where long-term planning and where there was a real vision from a government, also able to bring bad news. It's just often not happening anymore, because it will, you know, they assume it will cost their election, because it's going to be a...
Yeah, if you get elected and 2 years or 2 years out, you've got to start running for election again. It doesn't give you a lot of time to bring people bad news and tell them that they've got to, you know, tighten their belts. Yeah,
it's the same in, you know, it's the same everywhere. And we had a very remarkable case in the Netherlands where there's an NGO called Urgenda, who actually sued the government. And they sued the government that the government has a responsibility to take care of its population, and if they don't make sure that their conditions are appropriate, and could endanger their health, it's a human rights violation.
right.
And they brought the Dutch government to court, and they won the case. The Dutch government appealed. The Dutch government lost the case, and then they went to the Supreme Court, the Dutch government, and they lost. And now they have to obey, and we have to cut emissions by 25%. They have to. First case in the world. So what I'm saying is that it's a little alarming that it's NGO groups or whatever activists who have to bring an understanding and have to go through the courts to force governments to act.
Right, right. Are you seeing good things that are happening in Europe, or Katie, maybe are you seeing things that are happening, really effective policies, effective economic and environmental strategies that are being put into place? I'm curious, you know, if you've seen things good solutions, because we always focus on the negative.
Yeah, I am. I'm looking into them. There's this study that came out. I mean, you don't really need the study to know that people are kind of tuning out as far as climate change news. It's gloom and doom, and it's depressing, and there needs to be more solutions, or just solutions need to get covered more to get people to care. And then somebody made a good example of it, talking about, you know, like with coronavirus, we're talking about a vaccine. There's this timeline. We're talking about flattening the curve. There's things that you can do. There's some level of hope, even though it's an awful situation. And I feel like but we just don't even really talk about it with climate change. I mean, we do, but it means completely transforming the global economy. And which seems as if it's impossible, but it's not impossible. We just, you know, shut down the world for 2 months. So it's definitely not impossible to make these changes. Sorry, I got distracted. But so scientists are starting to listen to people that have lived with the environment and cared for the environment for thousands of years. So they're starting to listen to indigenous communities and base policies more on that, or at least base science that's going to influence policies more on that. I mean, it's by no means great and happening all over the place, but you are seeing more examples of, at least with conservation, with national parks, this idea that, you know, they're completely separate from the people that were already living there. The idea that, you know, if people are around, they're going to destroy the environment. In fact, some of them are doing forms of agriculture that make the environment more biodiverse in a place like Thailand and in Bhutan. So there are some examples of environmental managing that's now incorporating traditional knowledge of indigenous people more, which I see as a positive thing.
Right. Gotcha.
I do want to make a pitch. The Washington Post does have a vertical that is solely based on climate solutions. So
please,
I don't work on it, so I can't really talk with authority on it. But they're all stories that are focused around climate solutions, either
John, I don't know if you're still on, John. Maybe we could pull that up What is it called, Nick? Is there a title to the series, or?
It's a vertical, so it's at washingtonpost.com/climate-solutions. So let's just look. It's a collection of these different stories that we're working on, including a couple from the 2C project that recently won a Pulitzer.
Not sure.
So that was my that was my pitch to Jeff Bezos there. I'll take a raise, thank you.
Yeah.
So we actually at around the time we published the Arctic, we formed an entire climate desk at the Post. A lot of our coverage recently is all shifting towards the pandemic, but we have an entire team that's sort of dedicated to covering climate.
Yeah,
So
it's
definitely
great. You guys
sort
are
of
doing great work
definitely worth checking out.
to have.
No, I think it's really great. At the same time, you know, somehow we always think there's a solution to the problem, and sometimes there's just not a solution, you know. And I think with many of the climate stories, I mean, when we were, I think, you know, in all my research, I found the first scientific research which was talking about global warming was 1890. That's a while ago, you know. I mean, and the tipping point was in the mid 80s, and then so, you know, I mean, we knew this all along, and I think, you know, in the Netherlands and in the US, and I think there's incredible people trying to find a real solution, or at least that we can adapt to the situation. But we also have to realize that that things have some things cannot just be solved anymore.
Hey guys, Mike just he froze very quickly, but he should be rejoining us in a minute. But I thought we could just jump to a question that was asked by a man named Alexi. This is for you, Kadir. He asked, in your opinion, how can visual media help us to emerge from this pandemic and to construct a better world? It's a little bit off topic, but
Oops. To be honest, I really wish I could answer this, but you know, I mean, but especially us visual people who do visuals, photographers like Katie and me, we are stuck. And you know, I've been shooting my own little surroundings in Amsterdam, but you know, I mean, I really don't know. You know, I think that as was mentioned before, that the profession, the media as a whole, is taking a very hard hit now, because you know what we normally do, we cannot. You know, I'm stuck in the Netherlands since more than 2 months, and I'm starting to work here because I realized that I have to come up with stories which are closer to home, and they will not be at the other side of the world for the near future. So honestly, I don't know. Maybe Katie, you do, but I'm struggling with this.
Yeah.
Same, and also sort of trying to, I don't know, everybody has their own curve of accepting what's going on right now. Sort of, you know, I have, you know, every job I had for this summer has been canceled. But, you know, and now it's time to kind of like stop feeling sorry for myself and find stories, you know, find stories that are closer to home. And who knows, you know, I mean, if we ever do take the climate crisis seriously, we're all going to travel less. So it's something to think about and something to get used to. So I'm kind of trying to look at it like that. But yeah, we'll see. I don't think we know what we're looking at yet, because we're so stuck in the middle of it. So it's challenging as far as you know, visual stories and what's coming out. but hopefully everybody's doing their best, whether they're, you know, a writer, a filmmaker, photographer, and they are documenting their own reality, because this is an incredible moment in history.
I mean, I think there's definitely something to be said to documenting your own reality. And you know, a lot of the times, you know, within my job, I think a lot about our audience and what our audience tries to, you know, respond to. And I think that, like, even publishing work that is from photographers' perspectives about their experience throughout this, I think there's a lot of value to that. And that, you know, there are photographers that are stuck at home taking care of their children, just like our readers are stuck at home taking care of their children. And I think there's value in the stories that are closer to home too. And I'd encourage all of us visual people to you know, take a look closer to home too.
Right. John, I'm wondering if we have any other questions from our readers there.
Yeah, we've got one more here for both Katie and Kadir. What do you want people to take away from your work?
I mean, I think I just want people to feel something, and hopefully something for the people that are in the images and relate to them in some way. Because it's so far away. At the end of the day, the Arctic is really far from, you know, a lot of the audience is going to be seeing the images that I make, and it felt really far away to me before I went there. So I just sort of hope that it can make them feel more connected to this place, because what happens there is going to impact the entire planet.
Right.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I really hope, and I think that that's what Katie and I have in common, that by working on for a longer period of time on a story is that it becomes more personal, and that people can identify themselves with the people I photograph, that people can realize that they could also be in that situation. And just to get back to what I said before, or correct myself a little bit for what I said before, you know, I think if we talk about the climate crisis, sometimes I find it very difficult to think about solutions. But when I was shooting my project on waste, which basically was 6 major cities in the world, looking at how they manage or mismanage their waste, there was a solution to that as well. There's a solution for all of us to that, you know, and that there I really tried to find a balance between the cities who don't do well and cities like Tokyo who really are able to find a solution to some extent. So, you know, I mean, obviously, I think we all understand that there needs to be hope in the story as well, and it cannot just be misery. But by using different platforms and not just photography, but also collaborating with scientists and using video and doing interviews with people, I think it becomes multi-layered and more understanding, and will have hopefully an added value.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we're at the hour mark. I think we can wind down here unless there's any last questions, John.
Yeah, we've got one more. What has been the response to your work by the communities that you're documenting?
Great question.
I'll start with that. What's really been something that's been fun is everybody in Alaska is like pretty into Facebook. Everybody's on Facebook. So it's great. You know, you can get people images of themselves. It's a lot easier than kind of back in the day when you would have to send prints. I get a lot of my information because I'm Facebook friends with people and I'm following them and I'm figuring out, oh, this is when the ice goes out. This is when the hunting season's starting, because the normal activities aren't normal anymore because of the changing weather. So you don't really know when the thaw is going to happen and things like that. But I think the communities, you know, they're smart. They understand the media. They understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. They've been burned in the past, especially the Inupiat communities in Alaska during the 90s. There was a lot of anti-whaling activism that sort of conflated commercial whaling with indigenous whaling. So they're very sensitive about that. But otherwise, it seems like they're pretty positive about about getting these stories out and sharing it with other people, and they're taking their own really cool photos, and they're using social media to share images as well. So they're all very visual, so they get it.
Yeah. I'm wondering, one thing that brings up for me a little bit of a tangent, but I'm wondering, we haven't talked much about the COVID crisis as of yet, and obviously I think we all know these slaughterhouses where people are working shoulder to shoulder have become one of the most dangerous places in America to work. And here in the Bronx, which is an epicenter, where many of the grocery stores just don't have meat. I mean, you can't get meat anymore. And I'm wondering if you think a lot of people are going to switch to eating a more sustainable diet, because America, the kind of industrially farmed meat industry in the United States is it's a major polluter. Is that something, Kadir, that you want to talk about, or do we lose you?
Sorry, were you talking to me?
Never mind.
I was losing my.
Katie, can you respond to that at all? Is
Sure.
that something that
I hope so. That's a hope. Our food system in the United States doesn't make any sense. It's clear, and it's fragile, and it's destroying the planet, and there's no reason it should be the way it is. But it's got so much subsidy. So, maybe now that the government's going to be so broke after all of this, maybe they won't ever get the subsidy. I don't know. But it's awful. It's a vulnerable community that doesn't have power in this country, because a lot of them, are immigrants and undocumented, in order to kind of fight for those conditions. But
you're referring to farm subsidies from the U.S. government?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Which
if things were at cost, if the way food was created and sold were at cost, and it wasn't sort of all about, like the supply chain wasn't all about everybody getting everything whenever they wanted it for a low price,
Right.
and things were real cost, then I don't even, then maybe meat wouldn't be so damaging, because there just wouldn't be as much of it that everybody's getting.
Sure. Yeah, it will be interesting to see if this COVID crisis creates long-lasting changes, and hopefully a few of those will be positive, because it's been a disaster, and it's just wiped out a lot of families here in our community. And I'm sure where you are too. Yeah.
We hope so.
We do. I think we can leave it there, and I really want to thank everybody for signing on. Please keep in touch with us. If you have questions for the photographers, we will forward them on. You can send any questions or information, anything that you need to know, to info@bronxdoc.org. It's info@bronxdoc.org. And we'll get back to you promptly with whatever information we can. Please do check out our climate show. It's Trump Revolution Climate Crisis. It's at bronxdoc.org. You can see it. And we've got great work there by Marcus Yam that we did not see today. He's got an extraordinary series on the forest fires in California. Really incredible stuff. Stacy's work, Brian Thomas's work, really powerful work. So it's more than what you've seen today. So please log on. And I want to thank Nick. I want to thank Nick, Katie, and Kadir for joining us, and John and Cynthia for putting all this together.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you guys for doing this.
It's a pleasure. We'll talk again soon.
Very soon.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
Thank you all.
Enjoy your boat.
Okay.